Good morning. Welcome back to another episode of the Behind the Dogs podcast. I'm here today with the Steve Edelstein, Vice President of Growth and Partnerships at MyFBAPrep. First off, Steve, how we doing on this fine Tuesday morning?
I'm telling you, Tuesdays are always a challenge. You get through the first part of the week with Monday, and then Tuesday comes in almost like a hurricane. So it's all good, and we'll get through the day.
Hey, we'll manage. We'll get through it. So I guess just to get the ball rolling, why don't you give us a bit of a background to yourself, how you got into the logistics space? I mean, forgive me for making an assumption, but I don't think, 10-year-old Steve was dreaming about pallets and, logistics. So I want to hear kind of your background, how you got here.
Far from it, my friend. Started out, interestingly enough, in both M&A, liquidation deals, leveraged buyouts, from a private equity perspective. From there, got very involved with health, beauty, wellness, and personal care and products. And the long and short of it is I started realizing that curating brands and building a niche market that had a very specific demographic, we'll call presence and following, was probably the best way to build a business. Subject matter orientation is always a good place to be as far as how you build your ecosystem, your relationships, and simply your customers. So with that said, ended up building and selling a number of prominent skincare brands, all based on scientific formulation. But the one thing I realized that was most important, that was lacking in the industry, was a good understanding of logistics, supply chain, technology, application development, but most importantly, getting a product from point A to point B in the most effective, cost-effective, and honestly, logistical manner possible. So what did I do? I went and started working after exiting these brands, working with logistics companies. And that's how I got into this business. So you are right. 10-year-old Steve didn't wake up and say, I want to be in the logistics business. I don't want to be in the supply chain business. But, 10-year-old Steve did say, I want to be an entrepreneur and I want to own businesses and I want to understand what makes a consumer react to a product or a brand.
There you go. Love that. And I guess from breaking into the logistics space to where you are right now with MyFBAPrep, can you kind of give me that timeline and, the things you've learned along the way?
I've learned a lot of things. First of all, patience is a virtue. I think it's important that you follow a process, that you have procedural guidelines. And I think all in all, what it really comes down to is understanding, what are those necessary steps you must take in order to achieve the goals? Now, it sounds awfully lofty and very cliche to say that, but the simple truth is if you follow those steps and you understand what's in front of you and what you need to achieve, and you build a plan around that, I can tell you right now, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 times, you're going to be successful because at least you're following a process. If you don't do that and you scrimp and you try to eliminate steps that are critical to what you're doing, I wouldn't say you're going to fail, but the achievements that you're trying to get are going to be less impressive than what they would have been if you followed that process. So going back to your question, what did I learn? I learned a lot about technology. Okay, my attitude is that technology and transportation are the two central core elements right now, today, 2026, in the logistics, supply chain, manufacturing, distribution, 3PL, fulfillment, whatever you want to call it, industries, because technology is an enabler, almost the heart of the business. Transportation is how things get from point A to point B. So you need the technology to facilitate the order flow, the inventory that goes out to the end user, but you need transportation to make it cost effective and cost efficient and get to that end user, that customer, if you will, in a timely manner. So putting those two together in a very, very mature, very realistic, and need I say organized manner is probably the best thing you could do for your business right now. Brands will survive if they have the right product. Brands will survive if they understand their audience. Brands will never survive if they can't get their product into the hands of the people that are intended to use it on a consistent, cost-effective, and, needless to say, from a presentation perspective, making sure it arrives, hopefully in the manner it was supposed to be presented.
And how would you say technology and also transportation have evolved over the last 10 years? I mean, you see it a lot with technology, maybe not so much in transportation, but I just want to get your idea on it.
Sure, 100%. I mean, obviously, elephant in the room, and we all know what it is. 2 letters, AI. Okay, fine. We've said it. It's out there. It's on the table. Now, let's take your question. First of all, technology platforms, order management, warehouse platforms, transportation systems, need I say transportation arbitrage has come to the forefront in a very big way. Where we are today in terms of systems is a far cry from where we were even 10 years ago. Data attribution. Having a warehouse platform that allows for good, honest, clean data that is actionable and can be filtered, and it can be queried in the way you need it in order to get inference to what your business looks like and how it is surviving, and most importantly, how it is achieving the goals is critical. Having the ability to integrate various applications and various processes within the system to be able to be more efficient in what you're doing has changed tremendously. Systems are much easier to work with, and they are, from a cost perspective, much more effective. The last thing I'm going to say is invoicing, billing has come a long way. Most platforms years ago did not do a good job with not only integrating financial data, but acting and reporting and invoicing on the things which, in my opinion, is the lifeline of any business. And that is money, that is finance, that is getting paid for what you do for these customers. So with that said, those modules, that application, that invoicing, billing process and procedure has come a tremendous way since inception.
And I want to go back to the beginning of your question because you mentioned something that piqued my interest. Transportation arbitrage.
Yep.
What is that?
Okay, so simple language, it's the ability to leverage transportation, parcel, freight, LTL, full truckload, etc., in a responsible manner, reducing the expense to the company that is facilitating the transportation. Simple language, getting product out the door, but also being able to increase based on a gross margin, a percentage where transportation, and I'm saying it out loud, is a revenue area for a company. Now, there are a variety of different ways you can go about doing that. It all depends on the rate shopping you have in place, and there are a lot of companies out there, so I won't name them because there are too many of them. But the simple answer to all this is be responsible with your parcel timing, the expense, and certainly taking advantage of the opportunity based on volume, based on density, to increase that volume and decrease your cost. And therefore, adding a reasonable percentage, is not unheard of.
It's the first time I've ever heard of arbitrage in the logistics space. It's cool. Let's move forward. I'd like to learn, I know a little bit, but I'm sure the audience would like to learn kind of about what you guys do at MyFBAPrep. You're not, the run-of-the-mill 3PL. So I would like to, just give us the background as to what you guys do, kind of your core activities, and what really sets you guys apart.
Sure, 100%. I think the most important thing that we do is we handle most of, if not all, of the account management that takes place between our brands, which are partners, obviously our network, the 3PLs that participate in our network as a cooperative, by the way, under master service agreement. So I think it's important to note that the relationship between ourselves, MyFBAPrep, and the warehouse is absolutely critical, not only in terms of communication, but also in terms of invoicing and finance and how those fees get negotiated in such a way that they become very fair and equitable to all parties involved. Personally, I believe that although we are categorized as a 4PL, I like to personally, now this is my opinion, I like to look at it as a cooperative. I like to make sure that the path of communication is thorough to all parties. I want to make sure that profitability is met in all deals that we work on, because ultimately one side of the coin and it's a three-sided coin, by the way, which is bizarre in and of itself, always has some element of remorse. So either the 3PL does well and the brand doesn't get the pricing they need, which is outlandish, but that never happens. But hopefully that will never be a dialogue, a conversation. B, making sure that there's transparency between all parties, especially on the account management side. A lot of information gets passed between entities. It has to be fluid, it has to be accurate, and it has to be timely. And I think most importantly, our business is built on certainly relationships. And I know it sounds cliche to say that because everybody says relationships and timing and all those things. Yeah, it's important. That's very, very important. But I think most important is understanding the client. Who are they? What kind of business are they in? Do you have the ability to handle their product in the way that they expect it to be handled? Do you have things, for instance, like lot tracking and serialization and expiration dates and things that are critical to that process? The reason I'm bringing that up is because there's certain nuances that exist in every client relationship that you have to be attentive to. Therefore, go back to the value of MyFBAPrep. Large network coexists, lines of communication, fluidity in finance, and most importantly, options. We have geographic options. We have discipline options. We have specialty options. We have vast services, so value-added services that complement what we're doing on the day-to-day pick, pack, and ship side of things. And I think most important to also note is co-packing is a big part of our business. So variety packs, food, beverage, health, beauty, wellness, personal care, bundling, kitting, all those things that create other opportunities, not only for the end user, for the customer, for the consumer, but also for the brand to leverage a more diversified portfolio of products, which therefore gives options to the customer, which therefore creates that stickiness and therefore creates the relationship.
And going to the communication aspect, so you mentioned how you guys are responsible for kind of making sure that all communications from all parties are fluent, transparent, accurate. Why is it that you would assume that when you're entering into an agreement, that would kind of be intrinsic from the start? Why do you think that call it information asymmetry exists today without you guys, for example?
Well, I don't think it's us. I mean, first of all, I think, as you said best, Matt, the communication line has to be there no matter what. In any business, certainly in this business, because there's so many moving parts, so many pieces of information, so many technology points that have to be touched, etc. In our model, because again, we're characterized as a 4PL, and I'll just say it out loud. The traditional 4PL model, and some of my peers may hate me for saying this, can be very one-sided. And therefore, you either get buyer's remorse or brand remorse, as I call it, or you get 3PL remorse, whatever it is. There's always somebody that feels like they should have gotten more, or they should have achieved more, or the relationship should have been better. That's why communication is important. It goes right back to the profitability as well. Profitability is important. People are in business to make money, whether we like it or not. We can call it capitalism. We can call it a lot of different names. At the end of the day, that's what a business is here. So therefore, if you're going to be in the market to make money, to drive revenue, be responsible about it. Make sure that your brands are aware of what you're doing financially and otherwise. Make sure your 3PL relationships are fluid and understand exactly what those ramifications are. And then most importantly, have everybody be on the same page in terms of what those expectations are, how they're going to get achieved, working with a project plan, understanding the exact, expectations that are supposed to be achieved. And therefore, things should be pretty fluid. There are always going to be issues, but hopefully you minimize them.
And I guess going further into that, is there kind of a proactivity on your end to kind of educate the brand through this process of all the different, the lingo, the terminology, people in the logistics space like to use a lot of, forgive me for sounding a little bit dumb, but a lot of big words. So
no, it's not dumb. And they use a lot of acronyms and a lot of acronyms that they don't even understand sometimes, and they say it anyway because that's just towing the company line, as they say. So to answer your question, I think there's a lot of education that goes on. It all depends on who you're talking to. And you know the old term, you have to read the room. So read the room. You can understand fairly quickly whether a brand, whether a 3PL, whether a partner understands the terminology that you're using each and every day. If they don't, then you dial it back, you walk through that process, and you create a level of education. You don't want to be demeaning. You don't want to be insulting. You're not questioning their ability to learn. You're just helping them to understand the language that is important to getting things accomplished, and at the same time giving them a what I'll call a emotional understanding of what we, the 3PL, the 4PL, the logistics side of the business, goes through every day, so they can have an appreciation. That's all.
And I guess further into the education aspect, more specifically in terms of pricing, right? When you look at a rate sheet, there's a lot of different line items. A lot of 3PLs quote in different ways. How do you ultimately educate the brand and say, okay, what's the best option for you based on your specific needs?
Okay, so there's a few things that go on. First of all, before we even get to the pricing, we do scope the program. So we understand all the variables, all the expectations. We break it out by account management, by operations, by technology, all the things that need to be done prior to even shipping a product out the door. All of that is done in concert with the client. So the client is very aware of what is actually going to transpire. But most importantly, once we get to the pricing, that pricing is walked through. Not only the number itself, but the definition of that line item. To your point, there aren't that many line items in a fee structure, but they should be outlined and they should be explained. And again, the extent of detail of that explanation will really be dictated by how much that person, how much that client really understands the business. If they're fairly new and they're just getting into it and they're a neophyte, if you will, then you have a little more patience. You walk them through the line items and you treat them as somebody who's never done this before. Now, on the reverse, on the other end of the spectrum, you have people that are very well versed and they understand the terminology and they understand the items. Then it's more what I call academic. So it does run the gamut. But I think you have to be sensitive. And again, go back to that term, read the room. You have to understand who are you working with? What is the level of understanding? What is their level of involvement? What is their level of education in the industry? To your point, do they understand any of the terminology? And whatever they do or don't understand, you're going to fill in those holes.
And going to your point of, understanding who you're working with, we oftentimes see that 3PLs on a high level will kind of market themselves quite generally to where actually identifying the right partner is kind of difficult. Why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, give me your definition in this context of what a partner is.
Let's have a 3PL partner.
Oh,
Same
okay.
brand looking for a 3PL.
Well, remember what I told you earlier. Considering all things equal, we do a go through a vetting process. So we go through a vetting process operationally. How do they work? What kinds of procedures do they have? Do they have SOPs, standard operating procedures? There you go. There's an acronym for you. Okay. Do they have the processes and the procedures that are consistent, not unique, but consistent to the industry? Yes or no? Obviously, if it's yes, we move forward. We may dig a little deeper to understand exactly what that means. In most cases, because we're one practitioner to another, we understand that part of it. Systematically, go back to the platform. What kind of platform do they work with? How much functional behavior does that platform allow for the requirements of the program? Excuse me, does it align with what those systematic issues, again, or applications need to be? Okay, and those are important as well. And then as far as the education portion of it, we do get into the cultural. I'm a big believer that people buy from people. I've always believed that. So therefore, as far as the review process is concerned, again, considering all things equal, considering all things academic, we want to understand who's running the business. Who's the owner? Who's the president? Who's the CEO? Who's the warehouse worker? Who's the lead supervisor? Who's the forklift driver? Those people are as important, if not more important, than the C-suite, from my perspective, because they're the ones that are going to execute on the promise that we, as a company, make to our clients, and that's critical.
And I guess moving forward to that, like you mentioned, the whole vetting process is quite extensive, right? It's not like I always say, it's not like you're buying a pair of shoes, you're sourcing a business partner, right? So to that point, we've seen over the last, few years, a lot of digital marketplaces, platforms pop up to kind of aid the brands in actually sourcing the right 3PL. That being said, where do you see them being highly effective? And on the contrary, where do you see them, not being able to capture the full picture? Where do they fall short?
Well, I think first of all, let's go to price for a minute. Any deal that's a commodity-based program that's just based on price is probably not the right relationship. Sometimes, maybe that 1%, it makes sense, but the majority never makes sense. So going back to your question, algorithms are only as good as the data that's in the system. Interesting comment, right? AI says the same thing. AI is only as good as the cleanliness and the density and the value of the data. So with that said, the information that you have available via an algorithm has to be accurate. I'm old school, okay? I do believe in matching programs, but I think it goes so much further. It should never be conceived, that's a bad word, construed as a lead generation tool, because it's not accurate. Can be if you add all the other layers of data to it, meaning not just who am I, what do I do, and how much does it cost to do it, but where am I located? What are my specialties? Am I subject matter oriented? Have I worked with clients that have either similar or exact products that I'm representing? There's a lot of variables you have to look into. So going back to your question for the third time, matching programs can work, but there's so much more to it. And I would never, and again, I say this respectful of WearMatch, I would never rely on just that part of the process, part of the platform to make a decision. It's very simple.
Yeah. And would you say there's also a notion that when you're, sourcing a 3PL, there's a lot, slower turnover, right? Ultimately, if you find the right partner, you're likely never going to leave them, right?
Well, it's like giving your baby to somebody. It's like having a child and they're growing up. And now it's time to send them to either daycare or off to kindergarten or whatever it is. It's the same emotional attitude. And brands go through the same thing that parents do, that people do, individuals do. So you have to be aware of that. And therefore, go back to your education question again. The education is critical because that gives them a comfort level that you, the company, were in fact the right choice as a partner for their business. And let's also identify one thing that's most important. It's expensive to move a product into a facility. There's a lot of things that go into it. Not only the freight cost, but also the put away cost, the receiving cost, the QA/QC cost, make sure everything's done correctly. If there's packaging that's involved, the packaging has to be done correctly. So at the end of the day, it's really important that you check off those boxes one by one by one by one and make sure that everything is done in the order in which it was supposed to be done, period.
100%. Sorry, I look like Harvey Dent right now because the sun's rising.
Oh, that's all right.
Right at me.
Same thing going on here, brother, but don't worry.
All good. I guess my next question, let's flip the script a little bit towards the 3PL, right?
Sure.
So do you find that these platforms or these marketplaces ultimately help them find their right type of customer, right? Every 3PL's got their own, specialization or ICP. ideal customer profile. Sorry for using an acronym.
That's all right.
But yeah, I guess where does it help out the 3PL, and where does it, again, to that same point, kind of miss the mark or not capture the full scope?
Okay, so I made it sound like I'm contradicting myself based on my previous comment, but what those platforms, in particular your platform and others that are out there, do is they do cut through a lot of the unknowns. So, for instance, you get on the 3PL side, the brand gets an understanding of, again, who are they, where are they located, what do they do, what is it, all the things you just mentioned, specialties. So are they either very general, so they're generalists, and they can do a lot of things, the old adage, jack of all trades, master of none. And again, not to be negative, that's okay. You can be a jack of all trades. That's fantastic. But also understand that you're going to dilute not only the revenue in your company because you're overly diversifying, but you're also going to dilute the value and the execution that is taking place, generally speaking. And I'm going to say that, generally speaking, to the brand. Now, in a subject matter environment, the brand knows before they've even spoken to that particular 3PL that they either have an affinity or an understanding or a direct relationship in doing and executing programs that are similar to theirs. In simple language, it's a comfort level. So that's on the brand side. On the 3PL side, they can have an appreciation. Let's use an acronym, an ICP. ICP focused. Let's say it's cosmetics. They have a reputation of handling cosmetics. Client A, brand A, connects with them. They're a cosmetic company. It's a great marriage because right out of the gate, they understand the cultural, the day-to-day, and quite honestly, the product requirements from the get-go, from the start of the relationship. That's a perfect opportunity for both the 3PL and the brand to coexist.
And you mentioned the notion of, the 3PL having a reputation for cosmetics. And I find that often gets thrown around a lot in the way that, someone's known for doing something, but that being said, they oftentimes don't really market that. So we'll get into this rabbit hole.
Yeah, well, it's a rabbit hole because let's be very clear. And now people really won't like me by what I say. Most companies in the 3PL, logistics, manufacturing, distribution, warehousing, logistics, supply chain space do a horrible job of marketing.
Why do you think that is?
Because it's cliche. Cliche. Show the boxes, show the people with the vest, smiling like they've had the best day they've ever had in their lives. And the reality is it couldn't be farther from the truth. Working in a warehouse is a grind. It's a tough job. That's why I said earlier, have an appreciation for the forklift drivers, have an appreciation for the warehouse employees, have an appreciation for the lead supervisor, have an appreciation for the people who clean the cafeteria, for God's sakes. Those are the people that are executing on behalf of the brand. It's not the people in the front office. They may be making some decisions on behalf of what's going on, but the real work is done at the floor level. 100%. So yeah, that's why having that appreciation for the business and for the culture is really important. Now I probably went off on a tangent I shouldn't have.
No, that's great. We're gonna get even deeper into that. But do you think there's an aspect of the marketing, we'll call it the shortcomings in which, 3PLs as call it a general collective aren't very strong at, articulating what they're very good at. You find oftentimes they'll market themselves on a high level, right? We do warehousing, transportation, order fulfillment. But I mean, let's face it, every 3PL does. That's what sets you apart.
Well,
right?
that goes back to subject matter orientation and your question or comment about companies who profess to be experts in certain categories that don't necessarily do the best job of communicating that, at least not as outspoken as they could. That narrative needs to change. And based on the current landscape of what's going on in this business, and unless you live under a rock, you've got the tariffs and you've got the Iranian war and you've got all these different variables that are negatively affecting the industry. How do you get away from that? You become more subject matter oriented. You become more niche oriented. You get more attentive to who your customers are. You get more attentive to who your brands are. You get more attentive to the kind of technology that you really need in order to be successful. And most importantly, as I said in the beginning of our conversation, the operations, the processes, the procedures, the project plans, utilizing those things, going through a process, having those weekly meetings, having those QBRs, meeting with the client. It doesn't have to be a laborious, extensive situation. It just has to be done.
And I mean, in this industry, you could say that it is a lot more reactive to macro events. I mean, like you mentioned, the tariffs, the wars. Is it something on your end that needs to be a lot more proactive, right? So like you just mentioned, kind of making sure that all of your operations are intact. Is that something that you kind of have to look at beforehand? Or is it something that oftentimes is mostly reactive because, you can't really predict when a war breaks out?
Well, first of all, I think it's any good business, and I say this just as a general statement, should be attentive to the infrastructure of their business. So they should understand what they have in place, where their liabilities are, where their assets are, in the most simple language, and take care of those things to make sure that they are set up to be successful no matter what the situation is. So therefore, Matt, to your point, they don't have to be so reactive. Okay? Being reactive is always going to put you behind. It doesn't matter what it is. And I don't necessarily would agree that this industry is extremely reactive. I think that this industry sometimes is very complacent. And I think that's a bit of a different way of looking at it, only because I believe that we know what we know. We try to know what we don't know. And going back to my comment about being focused, and need I say subject matter and orientation, it just gives you a bit of differentiation relative to who you are and what you do, and therefore can become much more attractive to who you're working with. And most importantly, go back to your marketing question. If you do that successfully and your messaging is consistent, you don't have to do as much marketing.
Right. And then I guess even going forward from that, you learn all the time in business school, there's kind of two main strategies, right? You've got your differentiators and your cost leaders. In this space, which of the two would you see as kind of being the more, I'd say in the long run, which one's got the upper hand, for lack of a better term?
In my perspective, it's a differentiator. I think differentiators always win because you become unique, you present value, it becomes less of a commodity relationship, which means you can command a higher dollar for the work that you do. And at the end of the day, the perfection and the execution that takes place, and I'll say it out loud, is a lot easier when you're subject matter focused than being all over the place. It's also a lot less expensive to run a business that way because there's only so much you have to work with. 100%.
And going to pricing. So one thing that I've always kind of found interesting is how do you build out a pricing structure, right? Because ultimately you're looking at equipment, you're looking at rent. How does that factor into call it a per monthly pallet storage rate?
Sure. I mean, there's a calculation that I'm not going to go into now, but that's simply the answer in terms of how you get to that number. But I think it's also based on value in the market. You have to look nationwide. Now, you may break that down to a regional review. So to understand the economics of the area in which you live and breathe, you go down to the local level. And again, that comes down to, what are your charges for hourly labor, for instance? What are your charges for utilities and overhead? All of the financial variables you have to be in tune with in order to understand how you're going to come to that calculation from a storage, because really what you're talking about is storage. And remember, not to complicate things, but there are two different types of storage. There's active working inventory, and then there's backstock inventory, which just sits most of the time. And I just believe, again, this is my own opinion, but it does get a little more complicated as far as the accounting is concerned. We should have two different rates. We should have rates for static inventory, and we should have rates for active working inventory. Because at the end of the day, the idea always is to have product go in and out, constantly in, constantly out, always a churn, always making money. That's how you become successful in this industry. It's all about density. It's all about output. So with that said, making the economics attractive from a storage standpoint on the working inventory side of things makes much more sense. Pretty much
interesting. It's interesting. It makes so much sense. You know, if you're sitting inventory, it's going to be different than your active inventory. You might be the first person I've ever heard actually mention that.
Because most people don't want to say it out loud because they think that, because here's reality. It's like rolling the dice. You know, you roll the dice with a client who says, we have historical performance, let's say for conversation, 10,000 orders a month. And they come to you and 3 months in, they're shipping 500 orders. Well, the reality is they got a lot of inventory sitting. Now, should they get penalized for that? No, but the normal practitioner says we want to keep one price for everything. In other words, good and bad, good and bad, good and bad. I think you can do it differently. I think there's more value in reducing your static inventory that's not moving, that doesn't take, and I'll say it out loud, doesn't take a lot of labor to manage it, versus working inventory. You have to do cycle counts, you have to rotate your stock, all that good stuff. So there's labor attributed to it, therefore there's more value.
Love the transparency. Well, Steve, this has been awesome. I guess my last question for you,
Sure,
more so of a statement.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you want to get off your chest? Anything you want the listener to take home with, if they were going to understand one thing from this, what would it be?
Well, first of all, Matt, if you get to know me, and I hope you do, one thing is really difficult, because I have a lot of things to say, and I've said a lot. And I actually have a blog. It's not a blog; it's more of a LinkedIn post called "The Things We Think But Do Not Say," and I say a lot. So with that said, I think just most importantly, be kind. I think people in general, we're a people business. We're a relationship business. It's not a widget business, although some would disagree with me. I think there's an element of passion that goes into what we're doing. I think financials will always be worked out because the beautiful word of negotiation will always occur. Understand what's in front of you, understand what those expectations are. As I said, again, esoteric, communicate with your audience, communicate with your client, communicate with your partners. And again, most of the time, unless something unusual happens, things will be very successful for you. And I think most important, because I think everything else is academic. If you're in this business, there are certain things you have to check off, but the most important thing you can be is be empathetic, understand that people in business have a tough job. Everybody has a tough job. It's not easy. So have a little empathy.
It's awesome. I love that. It's my favorite answer so far. Well, listen, first off, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time. Looking forward to not only keeping this relationship building, but maybe we'll do an episode 2 in the near future. Excited for you to come out to Montreal, bring you to a house, some smoked meat.
I love it. No, I'm definitely we're definitely planning a trip to Montreal, not Toronto, Montreal, and see you guys. But I appreciate the time and I appreciate the opportunity to present some of these things. And believe me, if you need more, please come and ask.
For sure, we'll do. Awesome. Well, thanks so much and take care.